Did you know that Red Bull's worst result in 2025 wasn't an accident, but the result of a series of technical and strategic errors? What seemed like a simple bad race in Monaco actually exposed deep weaknesses that could cost Max Verstappen the championship. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, do you think Red Bull is losing its dominance in Formula One? What exactly went wrong with the most dominant team of recent years? In this video, we'll break down why Red Bull and Verstappen finished fourth in Monaco and how a series of technical decisions left them with no chance of fighting for victory. Max Verstappen arrived at the 2025 Monaco Grand Prix as the championship leader and Red Bull's undisputed figure. No one doubted his ability. No one disputed the power of the RB21. However, what unfolded that weekend was a reality check for the most dominant team in recent years. From the first free practice session, something wasn't right. The car wasn't responding. The times were slower than usual, and what started as a cold day for Red Bull quickly turned into a technical storm. Most alarming, Verstappen, accustomed to making a difference even in difficult conditions, was visibly uncomfortable behind the wheel. He couldn't find grip. He couldn't find rhythm. And above all, he couldn't find confidence. This circuit, unlike others on the calendar, is unforgiving. Monaco demands surgical precision. Any deficiency, no matter how small, is exposed. The uneven surface, the narrow layout, the tight corners, and the impossibility of overtaking make this a true stress laboratory for the teams. And this time, Red Bull failed the test. The RB21, a car designed with an aggressive philosophy for fast circuits and high-speed corners, showed all its limitations here. The car, which on tracks like Suzuka or Silverstone behaves like an extension of the driver, became an unpredictable enemy in Monaco. Every bounce, every loss of traction, every poorly negotiated corner was a clear sign that something was wrong. From the pit wall, the analysis was constant: telemetry data, dynamic performance graphs, driver comparisons. Everything pointed to the same thing: the car was not adapted to this environment. The chassis rigidity, designed to maximize aerodynamic efficiency, was unable to absorb the unevenness of the Monaco asphalt. And that, lap after lap, translated into a loss of performance. But the problem wasn't just technical. There was a strategic component behind it. Red Bull arrived with a package of updates specific to the circuit. At first glance, it seemed like a clever plan: a heavier-duty rear wing, tweaks to the front suspension, and a setup designed to improve handling. But what they didn't foresee was the side effect of these improvements. The car began to suffer from pronounced understeer, especially on the combined stages. This not only affected overall performance, but also influenced Max's driving style, who had to adapt on the fly to an unruly car. This was the context that marked the beginning of a weekend that, for Red Bull, will go down in history not for a single bout of bad luck, but for having starkly exposed the limits of its own design. What happened in Monaco wasn't an accident. It was a consequence. What appeared to be meticulous preparation by Red Bull for the Monaco Grand Prix ended up revealing a series of technical errors that compromised the entire weekend's performance. Internally, the team had been working for weeks on a package of improvements designed exclusively for street circuits like this one. The goal was clear: to make the RB21 feel comfortable in slow corners with abrupt direction changes and limited grip. But the result was just the opposite. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of a high-downforce rear wing. This part, in theory, was supposed to offer greater stability in the tight corners, typical of Monaco. Added to this were modifications to the front suspension system, seeking greater responsiveness to the raised curbs and uneven surfaces of the street surface. However, what happened was unexpected. The car began to exhibit persistent understeer, especially in technical sections like the swimming pool. In other words, the car wasn't turning as smoothly as expected, forcing Verstappen to constantly correct his trajectory. The problem worsened during the second free practice session. At that point, the data began to show a clear trend. Max was consistently slower than Charles Leclerc in the same sections of the circuit. The gaps exceeded 0.7 per lap, a figure that, on a track like Monaco, represents an unacceptable gap for a top-level team. The frustration was palpable not only in the garage, but also in radio communications. Verstappen reported a total lack of confidence in the front of the car, and the engineers seemed to have no immediate answer. The root of the problem lay in a technical paradox. Red Bull had developed several improvements at Imola, 2 races earlier, with the aim of optimizing the RB21 for high-speed circuits. These updates subtly altered the car's aerodynamic center of pressure, generating greater efficiency on the straights, but at the expense of stability under heavy braking and low-speed maneuvers. When that same package was adapted for Monaco, the result was an unbalanced car, difficult to read, unpredictable in slower corners, and dangerously reactive under rapid changes of direction. Adrian Newey, the chief aerodynamics engineer, had already warned about the risk of operating a car with too narrow an operating window. That is, a car that needs near-perfect conditions to perform at its best. On a circuit like Monaco, where imperfections abound, that window closed completely. The RB21 couldn't adapt to the environment, and this rendered it incapable of competing at the highest level throughout the weekend. Another critical point was the car's braking behavior. The previous modifications had shifted the RB21's balance to a point that made it unstable when entering corners. Instead of braking progressively and firmly, as Red Bull typically does, the car bounced at the rear axle, causing traction losses right at the key transition between braking and acceleration. This not only affected lap times, but also tire wear and driver confidence. For Verstappen, this was a psychological as well as a technical challenge. Accustomed to a car that responds perfectly, he had to adapt his driving style to a car that not only didn't cooperate, but also penalized him with every attempt to push the limits of the circuit. The result was an inconsistent performance, full of corrections, and a clear sense of frustration that grew throughout the weekend. Ultimately, the technical decisions Red Bull made for this Grand Prix not only didn't work, but actually amplified the problems they had been experiencing since Imola. And that, in a race like Monaco, where every 10th counts, ended up costing them much more than just a bad result. Even before the race started, the Red Bull garage knew that winning in Monaco would require more than just speed. They knew this because the RB21 wasn't performing as it should, because Verstappen didn't have the car he needed, and because on a circuit where overtaking is almost impossible, any mistake in strategy could doom any chance of fighting for the podium. Even so, the team decided to gamble. To gamble big. To gamble on an unlikely scenario. The idea was clear: extend the first stint on hard tires as much as possible, hoping that at some point in the race there would be an accident, a yellow flag, or a disruption that would trigger a safety car. The logic behind that decision made sense on paper. If the car couldn't compete with pure pace, extending the stop could put Verstappen ahead when the others stopped. Then, with a lighter car and a well-timed pit stop, the team could try to hold on to the position. But there was a problem. Monaco isn't a circuit that forgives such bets. Statistically, yellow flags leading to a safety car after lap 20 are less frequent in Monaco than on any other street circuit. Since 2010, only in less than 30% of Grand Prix races has a significant neutralization occurred after the midpoint of the race. In other words, Red Bull's bet was based on a low probability. And unfortunately for the team, that probability didn't materialize. Max completed a total of 45 laps on hard tires. This allowed him, at one point, to take the lead. But it was an optical illusion, a temporary advantage that couldn't be sustained without a neutralization of the overall pace. As the laps passed, the accumulated wear began to take its toll. The loss of rear traction became evident. The areas where the RB21 had previously been able to contain the pressure began to collapse. And then came Oscar Piastri's attack. In the final laps, Verstappen no longer had any way to defend himself. The McLaren's pace was noticeably superior. The degradation of the Red Bull's tires had reached a critical point. The compounds no longer offered lateral grip, forcing Max to enter each corner more cautiously. This loss of pace, lap after lap, left Verstappen without tools. Under normal conditions, he would have been able to hold off the attack. But not with tires that had lost almost half of their functional capacity. Meanwhile, from the pit wall, the engineers knew there was no more room to adjust the strategy. It was too late for a second stop. Too late to modify the approach. Too late to reverse the damage. All that remained was to resist and minimize losses. And that was exactly what Verstappen did. Defend as best he could, adapt to the conditions, and cross the finish line in a position that, although disappointing for a champion, was the best possible in that context. In hindsight, the safety car call was more a necessity than a choice. Red Bull knew they couldn't compete head-to-head under normal conditions. That's why they looked for an alternative route. But when that path didn't open up, they were exposed. What was intended as an act of ingenuity ended up becoming a sign of strategic impotence. A clear example of how even the most successful teams can get trapped in their own logic when the car isn't playing to them. This race didn't just showcase the RB21's technical weaknesses. It also revealed Red Bull's strategic limitations when forced to operate outside its comfort zone. And that, in such a tight championship, could have far-reaching consequences if not corrected in time. When a race ends badly, the data can explain what happened, but the words reveal what's truly worrying within the team. And in the case of Red Bull, the statements after the Monaco Grand Prix weren't just technical analyses. They were confessions. They were warning signs. And also, in some cases, reflections of suppressed frustration that hadn't been seen so far this season. Max Verstappen spoke clearly, but also with a tone that betrayed his annoyance. He said just the right amount, without raising his voice, without seeking excuses. But every word carried weight. When a driver like Max, accustomed to perfection, openly admits that fourth was the best we could get today, he doesn't do so out of politeness. He does so because he knows the problem isn't with his driving. It's with the car, and with the decisions surrounding it. During the race, his body language was already giving away clues. On the radio, the messages were more tense than usual. On lap 38, for example, Verstappen requested urgent mechanical adjustments. His tone was more demanding than usual. But the team's response was blunt. All options are exhausted. That phrase, although technical, suggests that Red Bull had reached a point of no return during the race. There were no more solutions. There were no more cards to play. The frustration was also evident in his post-race statements. Although he avoided directly blaming the team, he made it clear that they knew in advance that Monaco would be a weak point. And that is perhaps the most revealing part. It wasn't a surprise. They had already anticipated it. But even so, they failed to prevent the outcome. This speaks to a planning that fell short of its objective, and to a structural limitation of the car that not even the best driver on the grid could compensate for. On the other hand, Christian Horner was direct. He bluntly acknowledged that the RB21 is not a car for street circuits. His words left no room for ambiguous interpretation. And if the team principal publicly acknowledges this weakness, it is because internally the problem is more serious than it appears. What's interesting is that Horner didn't make excuses. He spoke of limitations, of technical features that need review. In a way, his speech suggested that the team's development approach might have been too aggressive in one direction, neglecting venues like Monaco. But where the statements became truly intriguing was with Helmut Marko. Always known for his forceful opinions, this time he dropped a phrase that changed the tone of the analysis. Radical solutions will be explored for Canada. This implies that what happened in Monaco will not be taken as a simple anomaly, but as a serious wake-up call requiring urgent action. There is even talk of testing a completely new hydraulic suspension system, something that wasn't in the original plans and could entail a change in the technical regulations if its legality is in doubt. The statements, then, not only confirmed the discontent, they also opened the door to a transformation in Red Bull's technical approach. What was once a consolidated line of development is now forced to quickly adapt to new demands. And that, in the midst of a tight championship, is no easy task. Because every change carries risks, and every missed race can make all the difference at the end of the season. In short, what was said after Monaco is as valuable as what was seen on the track. The speeches by Verstappen, Horner, and Marko aren't just opinions. They're symptoms of a team urgently seeking answers. And when trust is compromised, even the strongest leaders have to look inward. After the blow suffered in Monaco, there's no time for regrets at Red Bull. The calendar doesn't stop. The next challenge already has a name, the Canadian Grand Prix. And if there's one thing clear after what happened at the Monaco track, it's that the team can't afford another weekend with results below its standards. The pressure is now double. Not only must they return to the podium, but they must also demonstrate that they have the ability to correct quickly and effectively. Signs have already begun to arrive from within the team. According to sources close to the technical department, Red Bull has accelerated the development of several key parts originally planned for Hungary. Among them, a new flat floor with redesigned vortex channels that aim to improve airflow efficiency in low-speed areas. This part could make a substantial difference on mixed circuits like Montreal, where long straights combine with tight corners that demand mechanical agility and stable traction. Furthermore, work is underway on a major modification of the rear braking system. The idea behind this improvement is to reduce unsprung weight, one of the factors that most affects the car's response in slow corners. Less weight in that area means better control in the transition between braking and acceleration, exactly the kind of performance Verstappen didn't find in Monaco. These kinds of details, although not always visible to the spectator, make the difference between a competitive car and one that is exposed. Another critical point being analyzed is the relationship between aerodynamic efficiency and mechanical performance. The RB21 has been built with a philosophy that prioritizes speed in fast sections. This choice has made it lethal on tracks like Spa and Monza, but vulnerable in urban settings. The challenge now is to find a compromise, a version of the car that retains its winning essence, but can tackle more technical layouts without compromising its performance. This is no minor adjustment. It's a strategic reconfiguration of the development approach. There is also talk of advanced experiments with semi-active rear suspensions. Although its legality is still under review by the FIA, this technology would allow Red Bull to maintain aerodynamic stability without sacrificing flexibility in tight corners. It's a risky move, but at this point, any technical advantage that doesn't violate the regulations will be explored. In parallel, suspension arms made from ultralight composite materials are being tested, seeking to reduce inertial mass and improve the chassis response to sudden changes in direction. All this is happening while the competition is watching closely. McLaren has shown constant progress. Ferrari, although inconsistent, remains a threat. And Mercedes, quietly, is beginning to make up ground. Red Bull knows it can't rest easy. It's not enough to have the best driver. The car must perform. And to achieve that, the upcoming updates cannot fail. What's at stake in Montreal isn't just a good result. It's the immediate future of the championship. If the upgrade package works, Red Bull will once again set the pace. But if the changes aren't enough, a dangerous window of opportunity will open for its rivals. The season is still long, but every mistake counts. And every detail, no matter how small, can tip the balance.